Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. Hey, quick question for you. What single piece of art, maybe a song, maybe something else, do you think has the real staying power to outlast all our current laws, our histories, everything? And what could give something that kind of resonance? What's the secret? What makes it stick around? It truly is a magical thing when a creation hits it just right, you know? In America, the national bird is the bald eagle. The national tree is the oak. The national flower is the rose. So what should be the national song? I think most people would immediately include some suggestions from the patriotic genre, like Star Spangled Banner, of course, Yankee Doodle, Stars and Stripes Forever, God Bless America, or America the Beautiful, among others. But I would resist the pull from those obvious choices, and I'd go in a different direction. I really can't think of a more recognizable, iconic American song than Amazing Grace. Now, I know you're thinking I've heard it a million times. Funerals, state events, and yeah, you have. Of course, it's everywhere. But trust me on this. The journey this song took to becoming a global phenomenon is wild and full of twists you wouldn't expect. Now, before I say even the first thing about Amazing Grace, I want to acknowledge a huge debt of gratitude to Dr. James Kibler of South Carolina. For many, many years, there were always some things I suspected and believed about Amazing Grace, but it was Dr. Kibler who provided the energy and direction for my own focus, including this following quote from poet William Gilmore Simms. "One fine song will last when all the great volumes of laws and histories will be forgotten. This is the power of poetry made into melody." This episode is about the legacy of perhaps the greatest American song of all time, Amazing Grace. Is there any other song that even comes close to the impact, reach, majesty, and humility, faith, righteousness, devotion, emotion, passion, and love of Amazing Grace? If there is, I have not heard it yet. I've got the sheet music for Amazing Grace framed and hanging prominently on a wall of my home. Amazing Grace is definitely that one fine song that has lasted and will continue to last beyond the others. And it's more than just a song. It truly is poetry made into melody. Now, today I want to unpack the improbable story behind Amazing Grace and bring into focus the bits and pieces that turned this very personal thing into something everyone knows. And maybe, just maybe, find some clues about what makes any great work of art endure. You probably already know a little bit about the intense details of the lyrics penned by a reformed English slave trader named John Newton sometime around 1772, 3 years before Lexington and Concord. However, the phrase reformed slave trader is the shorthand version of his early life and leaves out so much. It doesn't even come close to his full story. It was something like out of a dark historical drama. Through the heinous and detestable practice of impressment, John Newton was basically kidnapped as a teenage boy by the British Royal Navy and forced to serve. Now, since he hated his service, he kept escaping and kept getting recaptured. And then, in what seems like a setup for a very, very dark joke, he volunteered to work on a private slave ship and slave plantation in Sierra Leone in Africa in order to get out of the Royal Navy. I mean, how does that even make sense? And it's like the opposite of a hero's journey. And then comes the big moment, the turning point in his life. His whole life hinges on this. At the age of 23, he was on board a private slave ship from that plantation and encountered a nasty, terrifying North Atlantic storm. And he thought he was a goner. I mean, he thought, this is it, I'm going down. Now, for the first time in his life, John Newton began praying for God to save him. And against the odds, the storm miraculously passed, and he would remember that day as the hour he first believed. Talk about a dramatic sequence. That experience would become the core of Amazing Grace, that sense of being saved from the brink, both physically and spiritually, and the wonder that even someone as awful as he deserved a second chance. It's all about redemption and being rescued from total disaster, the ultimate comeback. He gradually got out of the slave trade and became a follower of John Wesley during the Great Awakening. He married his childhood sweetheart, left the slave trade entirely, became an abolitionist, and started studying theology. And then, talk about a career shift, he became an ordained Anglican minister in the Church of England at age 39 and wrote the famous verses of Amazing Grace around age 47 for one of his church services in Buckinghamshire. You couldn't make this stuff up. I mean, if you tried to pitch this story, people would say it's too unbelievable. What's important to understand is that although John Newton did write several hymns for the Anglican Church, he did not write Amazing Grace as one. Now, to him, the words of Amazing Grace were his life's testimony in verse, so he never presented them as an actual song. That would come later, and from other people. In order to be a hymn, his verses obviously needed a melody, and finding the perfect melody for really the perfect verse was about as difficult as you'd imagine. Although John Newton never tried to match up his words to a tune, many others sure did, and with terribly unsatisfying results. Sometimes original melodies were composed specifically for the verses, and then other times they simply took existing tunes and swapped out the original words for Newton's. According to my last count, I've identified at least 10 different melodic versions of John Newton's Amazing Grace, and most of them are awful. Lots of duds in there. Now, perhaps the best of all the alternative versions of Amazing Grace was matching Newton's words with a tune called Jewett, composed by R.F.M. Mann. It's really not that bad, and although it's a far cry from the Amazing Grace we all know and love, it's certainly better than the rest of them. So here is my version of Jewett. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. See? Other than my singing, it's not that bad. Not bad at all. It just doesn't have that spark to make it stick, you know? But this is where a guy named William Walker of South Carolina comes into the story. Now, there were 2 other men named William Walker in his part of South Carolina, so to make sure everyone could tell them all apart, he was known as Singing Billy Walker. Now, the other 2 men were known as Hog Billy Walker and his son Pig Billy Walker, so you can probably figure out what they did. Now, Singing Billy Walker was what Southerners would call a character. He took an existing hymn called Harmony Grove, changed it up a little bit, tweaked it, and replaced the lyrics with John Newton's famous Amazing Grace verses in 1834. And that was the masterstroke. It clicked. The next year, in 1835, William Walker published a hymn book called Southern Harmony and Musical Companion when he was only 26, and one of the included songs was his new composite of Amazing Grace, which he called New Britain. And no, it's not New Britain, It's not going to be New Britain, it's New Britain. Southern Harmony and Musical Companion was hugely popular and immensely influential in the southern states. Hymn books like this, using shaped notes, were how most people in the South learned to sing and read music in churches and communities. Therefore, placing the newly comprised Amazing Grace in Southern Harmony essentially launched it into the public eyes and ears and gave it a massive boost. The earliest known printed version of the original Harmony Grove tune that Walker used was in something called the Columbian Harmony, which was another shaped note hymnal that was published in 1829. Although William Walker would have been certainly familiar with the Columbian Harmony hymnal, there's still some speculation as to whether he took Harmony Grove from that book or just already knew the tune anyway due to its popularity at the time. When we come back, we'll listen to the original Harmony Grove. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show. We'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
Welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show. And hey, Rip, did you merge the lyrics of my show with a tune similar to Amazing Grace? Yeah, I see what you did there. Well played, Rip. Wow, Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. Now, we've been talking about the origins of the hymn Amazing Grace and how Singing Billy Walker of South Carolina merged John Newton's words with an old folk song called Harmony Grove. So this is what Harmony Grove sounded like. Now, you can definitely hear how Newton's Amazing Grace lyrics were a perfect match for that melody, and the world would never be the same again. Singing Billy Walker's union of the Harmony Grove tune with John Newton's Amazing Grace words into a song called New Britain is the Amazing Grace that we all know so well, and it was published that way for the first time in Walker's Southern Harmony and Musical Companion in 1835. Later, in 1844, Singing Billy's own brother-in-law, B.F. White, their wives were sisters, published another songbook called Sacred Harp and included New Britain as hymn number 45. Now, originally from South Carolina, B.F. White established the Southern Musical Convention in Georgia in 1845, and his Sacred Harp songbook and Singing Billy Walker's Southern Harmony were basically the textbooks of this recurring annual event, and the remnants of the Southern Musical Convention are still taking place today. Now, Walker and White originally met at Baptist church meetings in South Carolina and singing events where they developed a mutual interest in music and became close friends. They shared a passion for sacred hymns, and they also apparently shared a passion for the Go Lightly sisters, as William married Amy and B.F. married Thirza. However, some strife developed between the two men as White reportedly helped Walker compile Southern Harmony, but Walker secretly took the manuscript north and published it under his own name without White's knowledge or consent. Therefore, there was an ongoing dispute between them over the authorship of that book. Well, you know how that goes, right? Business and family. It is significant, however, that both men published Walker's New Britain in both books, which cemented its popularity and drove it deep into the culture. Even a family squabble couldn't stop this song. It was too powerful. Now, the version of Amazing Grace that we know today is only slightly different than the original by Singing Billy Walker. Amazingly, this is believed to be the first ever recording of Amazing Grace, captured in New York in 1922. Now, by the way, B.F. White also included the Jewett version of Amazing Grace in the Sacred Harp Songbook as hymn number 105. So both versions coexisted for a while in the Sacred Harp tradition, though New Britain was clearly the more superior of the two. Now, the American folk singers of the 60s abandoned the sacred origins of Amazing Grace and attempted to use it as a secular political song or a protest song, an anthem for change. Judy Collins and Joan Baez both remarked that it was the most requested song at their concerts. But Joan Baez actually claimed to not even know that the song had a sacred meaning at all. How is that possible? According to her, she thought Amazing Grace was about the necessity of changing your views and voting differently. Have you ever noticed that one verse of Amazing Grace doesn't match the others? That verse about the 10,000 years? Well, those words were not written by John Newton. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe added that unauthorized verse to the song in her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, even though she herself didn't compose the verse. Most likely, the extra verse was written by a Welsh composer named John Rhys, and he probably pieced it together from fragments of different verses of another hymn called Jerusalem, Our Happy Home. And then much later, in 1909, the American musician Professor Edwin Excell published his own arrangement of Amazing Grace in a hymn book that became the most popular setting of the song by far. And since he included the 10,000-year verse, after that, it just kind of stuck. I've never considered that verse to be part of the song because John Newton didn't write the words, and Singing Billy Walker didn't include it. The persistence and pervasiveness of Amazing Grace is part of the DNA of American music. It blankets American life in so many different ways and manners, and it is truly a global phenomenon. And because of the pentatonic nature of the melody, Walker's tune fits perfectly with the Highland bagpipes, and many people around the world understandably associate Amazing Grace with Scotland. And the genesis for Walker's original tune may very well be Scottish, given Walker's roots of being a Welsh Baptist and the strong Scots-Irish influence in the South. Walker lived immersed in those sounds, the folk melodies of the various Celtic immigrants and settlers in the Deep South. His New Britain very likely grew out of that musical soil, and Amazing Grace is distinctively American. And the ultimate question really is, what is it about any specific work of art that allows it to stick the landing and travel through time and connect across cultures? From a slave trader having this life-changing catharsis to a guy in South Carolina having a brilliant musical idea, the whole journey of Amazing Grace is an incredible testament to how great art finds its own way, even in unexpected ways, to really last. How does understanding this story, this unlikely path, maybe inform you as to how you approach your own creativity in something you do? Hog Billy Walker and Pig Billy Walker would have certainly been proud of their homie. One fine song will last, when all the great volumes of laws and histories will be forgotten. This is the power of poetry made into melody. Thank you, everybody. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning.
Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune in to the Tom Daniel Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniel Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniel Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniel Show.